You look good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our November Willis Long and Friends. My co-host Dana was pulled away from a little family event with one of her kids being sick at school. She may join us in a bit, but I'm really excited that you've joined us again here in dialogue with our dear friends. As you know, our Early Relational Health Coordinating Center at CSSP seeks to advance early relational health across early childhood communities and health systems. This is really a paradigm shift of meaningfulness around the importance of partnering with families, about strengthening relationships, and the well-being of families and the next generation. I so love these sessions because it gives me a chance to introduce my most valuable colleagues, national thought leaders, friends who inspire me, but can inspire you, I hope, along this journey as we all seek to advance this early relational health. And today we continue that tradition. I'm really thrilled. Let me give us a bit of an introduction, and then I'll introduce my dear friend Dana Suskind. You know, all of us know that our nation needs to support the needs of families, and we're not doing it very well. The issues of parental leave, the childcare crisis, the need for universal access to family supports of all kinds. Of course, economic supports, child allowance, equitable living standards, housing, food, but more than that, the real sense that our nation values families and our next generation of kids. This is a critical agenda. And just imagine what it would be like if our nation embraced the supporting all families for their needs with knowledge, commitment, resources, and meaningfulness and value. How our families would thrive, how our children would thrive, and how our nation would thrive. Well, that brings us into the guest that we have with us today, Dana Suskind, who is leading that kind of thinking with her movement making around building Parent Nation, that effort to foster the growth of communities to support and elevate strong identity for parents and all of our shared desire for the best of children, and advocating as a nation that we listen and respond to the needs of families. So this movement is building momentum, and I'm incredibly honored that Dana is joining us today. I first met Dana at an AAP conference in San Diego. Dana, you remember that?
I absolutely do.
We sat across the table from each other. You inspired me immediately with your vision, your leadership, your voice, and that time, the 30 million word agenda that was building. I think your first book came out. And then you've moved ever further. Let me tell you a little bit more about her. Dana Suskind is a professor of surgery, pediatrics, and public policy at the University of Chicago, co-director of the TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health. Internationally recognized as a thought leader, and I really want to emphasize that, who's dedicated her research and clinical life to optimizing foundational brain development and preventing early cognitive disparities and lifelong impact. She authored that book, 30 Million Words, Building a Child's Brain, which became a New York Times bestseller, and then the Parent Nation book, Unlocking Every Child's Potential, Fulfilling Society's Promise, which empowers parents to use developmental neuroscience to build a society that works for families, not against them. It's really an exciting movement. So today, we're going to talk about Parent Nation and how, of course, early relational health is a part of that. But let's begin. And Dana, maybe you could start by just, telling us about yourself, your journey, how you've come to be so passionate, how you've come to be where you are now. Just let us know about who you are and how you think about this. Then we can get further into this great dialogue. But it's a delight to have you with me, Dana. It's a delight.
It's a delight. Thank you so much for having me, David. I remember our first meeting well, although let me be clear, I knew of you and your incredibly important work, way before we met. So it was so great. It feels like yesterday, although it's been several lifetimes ago. And when I think about where I was then in terms of my thinking and where I am now, it still very much centers on what binds us in terms of a vision, that it is at the end of the day about that early relational health that allows all children to thrive. But really, I've sort of zoomed out even more in trying to understand what are the contexts necessary to allow that to happen. But let me start from the beginning, which is what you wanted me to do, which is to share how it is that I am a pediatric surgeon, a pediatric cochlear implant surgeon to be specific, and doing work in this space. And it's actually sort of interesting. Probably about 13 years ago, I was here at the University of Chicago, and I started our pediatric cochlear implant team. And for your listeners who don't know, a cochlear implant is an amazing piece of technology that allows a child born deaf the ability to hear, to talk, and really mainstream educationally and socially. And pretty soon after starting the implant program, I started noticing profound differences in the outcomes of my patients after surgery, with some of my patients excelling developmentally and others not at all. Some learning to talk, others not at all. The ability to hear, it turned out, didn't always unlock their full potential to learn and thrive intellectually. And because I couldn't accept this or ignore the disturbing disparities amongst my patients, I journeyed far outside the operating room into the world of social sciences. And for me, what surprised me was that learning not only how critical those first 3 to 5 years of life were, but just the fact that the vast majority of physical brain development, close to 90%, is occurring and is almost entirely dependent on the early language and nurturing interaction, what we call early relational health, but that nurturing interaction. And in understanding this, it really set my whole trajectory of my life's work, which is, how do we allow all parents, all caregivers to understand the power of their language for building children's brains, and more importantly, allowing all children to thrive. And so in the beginning, much of my work, as you can tell from my first book, 30 Million Words, really centered on the individual level. What do parents and caregivers need to understand from the science and the strategies to allow healthy brain development? And that's where 30 Million Words and the center, the TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, really came forth. So that's the beginning. And I want to be clear that we've really moved away from that 30 million words framework. But that idea was, I always say, was strong enough to pull me, a surgeon, out of the operating room. But I have learned much, much more about, it is about that early relational health to give every child the best earliest start. So is that too long of a way to?
Not at all. That's where we really got bound together because of optimizing potential. You, from the surgical view, you have a technique of resolving a major sensory struggle by an intervention and then discovering right into the center. And then how do you nurture the growth and development coming right up against the vulnerabilities and the challenges of not only knowledge, but also the context within which families live. And then you're right into, my gosh, it's not just the relationship. And of course it matters, but how hard it can be for some families. The nature of what goes on around them with the needs and the demands or the barriers or the disruptions, and tackling the linking between, your knowledge at this level and then thinking about public health and then thinking about policy, but then thinking about all families care about the well-being of their children. And yet there's so many forces that make that really difficult and challenging. So you want to talk about this Parent Nation work you've been doing, and especially because I think it's absolutely thrilling, but you've captured something in a movement making. You've taken a pulse of this nation and sensing a movement that needs to be called out and built upon the post-COVID period, the racial equity period, the socioeconomic call. If there's something really big that you're touching, I'm really curious if you can talk about how it came to be and then what the journey's been with that part of the work.
Yeah. Well, let me share how it came to be, because, I always say that the early work was really inspired by this incredible brain science that shows, the incredible power that parents and caregivers hold in building children's brains, and how it sort of shaped my early work, which was really focused on allowing all parents to understand, not just the knowledge, but the strategies, et cetera. And, in our journey at the center, we, develop evidence-based programs to work with parents, leveraging the healthcare sector, the home visiting, et cetera, worked with incredible parents, and as you say, the one thing I can tell you that is a universal is that all parents love their children. All parents just want to give their children the best possible early start. It's just that in some communities, in our country, we make it hard on all parents. And for some parents, we make it almost impossible. And that's the other universal. But, so in our programs, we developed these programs, but what became so clear was how hard we make it, and that that you can give parents the knowledge and skills, but if they're in contexts that make it impossible, from economic to the racial inequities to the injustices, it's how do parents put it into action when we've made it so difficult? And the truth is this became painfully apparent the more deeply I engaged with the incredible families at the TMW Center. Because our studies followed children from their first day of life into kindergarten, my team and I were getting to know many families up close and over time. And what was clear was that parents' enthusiasm was thrilling. Look, they embraced what we called the 3 T's with gusto. They tuned into their children. They talked more as they went about their daily lives. They took turns encouraging their children to participate in conversation. As I said, they wanted what every parent wants, to help get their children off to the best possible start. The problem is that these strategies only took parents so far. Real life would intrude again and again and again, unpredictable work schedules, multiple jobs, lack of healthcare, structural racism, homelessness would just, intrude again and again. And I became increasingly aware that, parenting, it's very obvious, is not done in a vacuum, and neither could our research. And we have to not just acknowledge, but work to remove the hurdles looming in front of so many mothers and fathers. And really, that is sort of what brought me to this next point of saying, okay, here we've got this incredible brain science and developmental science showing, all the ways that nurturing interaction, this early relational health, build children's brains. But our society really is almost built in diametric opposition to it. And how could maybe this same developmental neuroscience lay a path forward for a society that truly puts children and families at its center by using that framework to reimagine what our society looks like? And that's really where this idea of Parent Nation came from. So I'll stop there. I feel like
no, it's so on point. First of all, 2 thoughts. Our nation makes it hard for all parents. It's a really profound statement and truth. But thank you for saying it, making it visible. But secondly, ever more important, how painful it is, how impossible we make it for so many. And this is a societal issue deep. And thank you again for calling that out. So you've written your book. How did you name it? Parent Nation. How did that happen? I'm curious. How did that happen? And I know behind you, communication really matters. Communication strategy really matters. So how did you come to Parent Nation, the naming of the book, please? And then I want to hear the journey. I want to hear the journey of it.
Yeah. The name. It's so interesting because, my first book I called, obviously 30 million words from that famous research study by Hart and Risley, which, let me be clear, as I learned more, was an incredibly, had many issues from a scientific, standpoint. But what was so not overwhelming, but shocking was just how much people glommed on to the terminology, the framework. And I realized people need frameworks to really understand super complex issues. We know it's not about number of words, right? But it was something that people were like, oh, this gives me something concrete that I feel like I can make a change in for my child or in my community, et cetera. So I learned that the frameworks were really important, and you had to be careful in how you chose them. And so as I was thinking about this next book, I tried to imagine what was the change that I wanted to see in the world, right? And, we thought of somebody suggested, what about brain print, right? How the brain can map out what a society looks like. And it just did not have the right range. And, people because I realized that in some ways my first book did as well as it did, probably because of the darn title. And so I thought, what do we want to manifest? Well, we want to manifest a world that really puts children and families at the center, that starts viewing parents, and I see parents in the broadest, parents and caregivers, not just as contributors to our society, but really the guardians of our society's future.
And we often say the whole next generation movement depends right here. Yes, go ahead.
No, exactly. And so in some ways it's an ideal. I mean, people like to use the term, it takes a village to raise a child. And well, that's a fine saying. I think it's more appropriate to say, look, it takes a parent to raise a child and a society to support that parent, right? COVID-19, COVID and the pandemic made clear that none of us were really supposed to parent without supports, right? It is hard. And in our society, especially, we've convinced people that this is not just a go it alone situation, but that we shouldn't receive the supports. It's sort of like expecting me as a surgeon to go into the operating room, take care of somebody's child without any supports in the operating room, without a nurse anesthetist or a circulating nurse or an anesthesiologist, et cetera. Like nobody would expect me to do it. But in some ways, the most important job we have is raising the next generation. We always say lip service, the most important job is parents, right? They're the first and most important teachers, but we leave them on their own. So this is a long way to say, I thought, gosh, I want people to have a visualization. What is a parent nation? It's an ideal. It's not a movement or a structure. It's a nation that really puts children and families at the center and really understands how important parents are and the support for them is. So that's how we came to that, or I came to that name. It's not a thing, it's an ideal. And then, so the writing of the book, it was really interesting. I had started thinking about it long, obviously before the pandemic hit, because these barriers were so clear. And I was looking at it through the incredible families that we work with on the South Side of Chicago, and just seeing literally how impossible it was, seeing parents deal with things like homelessness or the carceral state, one father who was incarcerated for 5 years, waiting a trial that quickly exonerated him, all these like incredible stories that made it so clear how impossible we made it for these families who just wanted to get their kids off to the best chance. So I thought about this book through that lens initially. I was going to tell those stories and sort of, lay the framework. And then the pandemic hit. And what was so clear then was that all parents in this country were struggling, right? The left, the right, religious, all racial, and ethnic backgrounds, everybody was struggling. And to be clear, we've made it impossible for some, so it's not to diminish that impossibility. But I was like, what, maybe telling the story from that lens, right? That in my 20 plus years as a physician, I've learned that all parents want the best for their kids. All parents want the same thing, but yet we've created a society that may have made it impossible. And maybe laying out a framework that could give a vision of what a society could look like, that put children and families at the center. And so I guess in some ways that's a long way of saying the pandemic really helped reframe the book a bit, to widen the lens, because I think there's so much that can bring us together and make it better for all, and especially those that we've made it impossible for.
Yeah, that's so powerful and so important. And the words again of we make it hard for everybody, but the painfulness of how impossible it is for many, and how that through the pandemic, all of that got exposed so that we were all in this together. I've followed, Phil Fisher and Joan Lombardi's work around the rapid EC data, right? The surveys that he's done, of the, that 1,000 families that have been followed through this serving their experience. And, there's a lot of interesting information in there that goes right to, Dana, your view, which was the degree of stress within families during that period was shocking at every socioeconomic level. Secondly, the other discovery within that was, and connectedness to community or connectedness to neighbor or to family was a protector. Thirdly, when the cash transfer came in and families, especially those of greatest need, had some degree of buffering financially, the stress level went down. Oh my gosh. And their children's well-being, as described by behavioral symptoms, also went down. I mean, give me a break, right? And then we pulled it out from underneath them, which is, horrific. I'm still furious about the data of evidence of all of that. So the whole, I would argue that the nation collectively, as a parent community, had so much of a similar yet variable experience in the moment that it gave a chance to bring a framework messaging that parent nation is really essential here for our political thinking and our policy moving forward. Framing really matters. We discovered that around the early relational health framing. We did the frameworks analysis, who helped us look at the frame around early relational health as an example of the messaging power when one uses a frame that captures attention. And the frame is the first message. Behind that are the details. And Parent Nation is a frame that captures the moment of people's knowledge and heart, and that has them listen in really good ways. And you've been riding that wave with your work. And tell me about, as the book came out, what's happened, what's that journey then for you? What has surprised you? What's gratified you, right? What has been that part of the journey of them, from the twinkle in the eye of writing a book in the wee hours of the night and the morning hours of the night. And then it's released. And then what happened? Talk to us about this.
Well, I'll tell you something funny before I go into that. I always say writing a book is like having a child, right? The easiest thing is to think about it. Then you come in and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so much work. But then it comes out and you're like, oh, I do love you. And then you're like, never again. And then you forget.
Never again, but that was too close, right?
That's it. Gosh, I want to actually just sort of speak to the few things that you said before asking me this, related to the stress and the cash transfer and, the connectedness and the Phil Fisher. I mean, it really, at some level, I don't want to say this, but it's like, well, of course, right? Of course, when, all parents are feeling incredibly stressed, when you've got the connectedness that helps alleviate it. But there's some aspects like this cash transfer that, of course, if you're worried about your next meal for your child, right? Or, or keeping a roof over your head, that's going to add stress. That's going to impact that relationship, and that early relational health, your mental well-being, your children's trajectories. And we know so much. I mean, that's the hard thing, is that if we didn't have one more research study, we sort of know what to do, right?
I know.
And it's
that's what drives me, Dana. I mean, every day, it's like there's new babies born every day, and they're coming into a system and a structure that does not provide the support that every family knows they need. And we all know it and we witness it. That mission-driven maintenance is just, fires me up like you. I get it.
Yeah. And the thing is that these, and then I'll answer your question, these programs pay for themselves, right? I mean, you can say, look, it's all about, people, we do things because they're morally right, or at least we say we do at times. This is not just morally right. This is like a no-brainer. I mean, the cash transfer, we've got research showing that it pays tenfold in later improvements in health, workforce development, decreased criminality. It's like, okay, people, this is not just like doing the right thing because we care about kids, which we should, right? I just find it so interesting. So I guess that brings me to sort of the reception. Look, I've been so heartened by, I'll start with the positive. I've been really heartened by, much of the reception, right? I mean, the attention, the media attention, et cetera, it's been lovely. And we've got, actually, there's I mentioned I've got an op-ed coming out in the Atlantic, putting forth the larger idea of the book related to, a parent AARP, which I can talk to you about in a second. So that part has been lovely. I've been talking, the media, et cetera. But really the big changes that we want to see, if we use that as a metric of, have we really shifted the supports that parents are getting? And not that I had any illusions that a book would cause that, but I certainly thought that the pandemic would result in that, right? That you didn't need the light shine because of a book. You have the pandemic, which showing all these parents, and childcare providers, struggling to keep their head above water while, shining a light on just the lack of infrastructure and just how fractured our nation's infrastructure of supports for children and therefore parents really was. I thought, well, that would result in some change, right? No, we didn't get that big change that we were hoping for. But even in this recent reconciliation, there was not one bit of support for children and families. That's pretty shocking. And, we've talked about, look, a parent nation is not just about policies from the, federal or state government. Certainly their policy is an important part of it, but even, it's the role of healthcare, the role of business, the role of all society coming together. And even like the idea of paid leave, the fact that we don't have it as a nation, we're like the only one of any developed nation, but the fact that even, HR, businesses are rolling back that sort of support. It's like, oh my, it did not, we haven't shifted in that way. So, which takes me to, one of the big arguments of the book is that here we've got we've got a universal understanding that parents need more support. Parents want more support. Childcare providers need more support. We've got the research case. We've got the, scientific case. We've got the economic case, both from a long-term benefit, but even from businesses today are losing so much money because of the lack of high-quality childcare and the like. What we don't have is the public and political will. And really what we need is, that public will so that policymakers and society feel like they're accountable, that, to support parents and children so that our country can thrive. So
movement making is a big task, a hard task, takes multiple voices and strategies. And I think your little Atlantic article coming out, you've alluded to this idea that you're raising about how do you galvanize ever more public interest and public direct expansion, as well as influence. And can you share some of that?
Yeah, there are many. What's super interesting is that when I think about this space, there are many groups, both parenting groups and different orgs that are fighting for everything from childcare to paid leave to child credits. But even within the groups, sometimes it feels fairly siloed. We always talk about the early childhood space is siloed, but even our advocacy in some ways is. And, I think about a bright spot in our nation's history for another age demographic, back, 50 plus years ago, it was actually the elderly which are the poorest, most underserved segment of society. Over 50% live below the minimum standards of decency. And because they were faced with crippling healthcare costs, and the like. And so really the AARP and the Gray Lobby help really transform what it is to be elderly in this country. I think no age demographic is better supported today, through things like Social Security and Medicare. The poverty rates have decreased by 70% for the elderly. And what's really incredible about the AARP is that it unifies, across racial and ethnic groups. They're 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 independent. It really reflects the broader, age demographic. And in that same way, when people say, look, we are in an incredibly divided time, but here is a group that has shown what it means to advance the interests of all of their constituents. And I think in some ways, when you think about parents in this country, especially parents of children in the first 5 years of life, especially, they're all struggling in their own ways, and they're all unified. I always say the science is clear. There are many ways to parent children, right? There's many, everybody thinks it's this way or that way. There are many ways to parent children. There's only one way to build that child's brain, right? Through early relational health. But there are many, ways. And if parents sort of saw their unified desire just to get their kids off to the best possible start, and that, pushing forward some of the, whatever their key strategies were, whether it be, paid family and medical leave, child credit, high quality child care, whatever they decided, in the same way as the AARP, I think we could really push forward more support for parents and children. So
carry that a little further. I mean, I think it's an incredibly fascinating idea, because AARP, of course, touches that whole age group of people and is accessible to a huge voting bloc, a huge financial resource in terms of small dollars of membership for some elements that can be then distributed. There's unlimited degree of resources and opportunities for small dollars, but large number of people as a voting bloc, as a consistent group. Carry the thought process of that to the parent nation view. I think it's fun. I've heard it, Dana, in some other sectors recently. So the idea is starting to percolate around, which is thrilling to me, because ultimately it's power, influence, dollars.
Yeah, I mean, that is how things work in this country. No, I think, first of all, the AARP is fascinating. When they decreased the age of membership to 50, it obviously increased their membership. They're right now almost 38 million people, and even people in their 20s are joining, because the truth of the matter is that there is much a market, a marketplace. They're a business. They've got three arms, but their business arm, which is not tax, it's obviously taxed, is things like healthcare, discounts to movies, et cetera. They bring in $1.5 billion a year. 1.5 billion. So, right. I mean, and as a result, they have the ability to sort of, ensure that their constituents are cared for, right? That's their stakeholders. And it's not just, there's lobbying, there's a lobbying piece, which is not a small piece, but they're also working with businesses to make sure that there's no age discrimination and really rethinking.
There you go. And I also was thinking, this sense of a parent nation like an AARP, there are a heck of a lot of grandparents out there that could wish that these services were available for their kids too.
They're worried about their children, right?
Generational. It's a very, very strong. Now you just mentioned in terms of, the sense of services and discrimination and equity. How do you think about this related to anti-racism and to equity? I mean, how do you, as you start to think through the sense of building like an AARP, like parent nation organization, whatever that is, how do you think it captures the anti-racist and equity movement? Because now, Dana, this, more than 50% of babies born are BIPOC.
Yeah.
And a majority of them, unfortunately, are in communities and neighborhoods where there are really, vulnerabilities and challenges to their future well-being. Yeah. So we're already in it. So a constituency that really focuses on the well-being of all families and creates a push towards equity and is really meaningful in terms of supports and activity. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, and I must admit, like I'm putting out this vision. I, I
I hear
I'm
you.
trying to manifest it in the world. So, but, I always think back to the fact that the AARP has decreased poverty rates by 70%, right? Disproportionately positively impacting those who are most vulnerable. And I would imagine that would be, a similar, that's exactly what would happen, right? And it's a really interesting story how it all began. I'm sorry, I'm like now going, I was thinking about, so the woman who started it was this woman, Ethel Andress. And what's fascinating about her is she was a retired teacher. She actually started this in her 60s. She started the ARP in her 60s when
There's
she
hope for us.
what?
There's hope for us.
Yeah, exactly. Seriously. I mean,
Oh,
excuse me, she was pretty darn cool. So she was a retired teacher. She was living in California, although she was from Chicago, interestingly. She even she volunteered at the Hull House for a little bit. She was a U Chicago graduate. And when she was a retired teacher, she was helping, I can't remember exactly, but she was helping something with retired teachers. And she tells the story of visiting a retired teacher who was of great esteem. I should find out. I think she was a Spanish teacher. I should look that up. She was a Spanish teacher, and she went out to go do a site visit because they were looking. And she found this teacher in high esteem who had lost everything in the down market, living in a chicken coop. And it was that which really was like, and which spurred her on. What was very interesting, though, is that what's her answer initially was, it was, this woman had lost in real estate, but most elderly were being crippled by healthcare costs because there was no health insurance. Like that's look at Medicare, right? That's transformed, what the elderly, are supported. So she actually initially started with a market-based solution. So her first partner was this guy with the last name Diamond, which it didn't turn out perfectly, but he was a seller of health insurance. And so they started selling it to retired teachers. And then it was quite clear that all elderly were hungry for it. So she expanded it. So the funny thing is the ARP didn't start off at all politically. It started off almost like a business for good, right? It wasn't supposed to make a bunch of money, although this guy Diamond, this is where like misaligned incentives can get in the way. He started providing not the best of insurance, so he got pushed out, and now it's much, much better. But what's interesting, it didn't start off in this social movement for now. And then I think as she started seeing sort of the unfairnesses, right, from age discrimination to the lack of, retirement, et cetera, that's when they became more, politically active on behalf of its constituents. And going back to your question, had that framework of those who are, most vulnerable, being disproportionately supported, but having, I guess, I don't know if it's a universalist frame, but, universalist frame of, for them, it was, the elderly were often sort of sidelined, but it was not to be served, but to serve was there. And in some ways, the framework of this, whatever it is, the National Associations of Parents and Caregivers, or whatever people will call it, will be about the fact that all parents love their children and all parents deserve the support in raising the next generation, and having equity.
The parent leadership role here, and the families that know of the barriers to their long for success, the activation of the grassroots in this space is really this moment in time as a great opportunity, and galvanizing that power into movement making than this, than finding there's already many organizations of
Yeah.
parent leadership all across the nation who would long for some kind of connection to see a possibility of, building local supports and then state supports and then community supports and then building into a network that
Yeah.
can. There's a movement strategy there, Dana, that I think is really important to capture. And as your Atlantic paper comes out, it'll be really interesting again because it'll be seen, it'll be visible, it'll be curious to see what
We'll see what the reception is.
Vision leads change. You know that. Vision leads change, and taking the pulse of the moment, as you do, as I do, as many people do, because you're with families. You listen deeply with heart. You listen to the painful realities. You see the structural inequities, and the outrage that brings. But knowing that one has to be methodical in terms of finding a path forward is really important. So, Dana, do you include parent leadership, parent voice to help you in this journey? Have you created?
Oh yeah, I mean at every step of the way. I mean this is not just a reflection of parent voice, but the deep belief that not only is parent voice important, but that they need to understand how important they are. The one thing that I can tell you that in some ways, our country has because our country has convinced parents, especially mothers, that this is a go it alone thing, right? And when things aren't going right, it's because of an individual level failure as opposed to understanding how the structures have made it so difficult, that in some ways that's divided us. It's filled often parents, especially mothers, with this sense of shame, like I'm not good enough. And I think it's dampened voice. I think it's dampened the opportunity to build a collective identity, to be able to look to the left and the right and see allies in the same desire of giving your child just the best chances. So I think that not only is parent voice important, but it's important for moving things forward. Because if we're convinced,
it's important in the collective.
yeah,
It's important in the sense of the myth of this country is that individuation is the most important outcome. We've lost the criticalness of connectedness, and the criticalness of connectedness, which is not only for every one of our well-being, no matter what age we are, but essentially critical for next generational building, which is why the early relational health work is about culture shifts, about collectivity. It's saying, watch out, because the focus on the individual has now caused us disruption. We're feeling it in our youth. We're seeing it in our children. And families all know it. And thereby this sense of collective, the greater whole, and the criticalness of connectedness, of collectivity, of networks of at every level of being, from person to person to neurodevelopmental, right? The connectivity between brains to brains builds the next generation. But if we don't have opportunity, or worse, we make that an impossible experience.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I can tell you that in addition to on my journeys in writing this book, and I spoke to so many parents across the aisle, not only was this sense of, how hard we make it in this country, but this sense of isolation and loneliness that I think is very much the result of and an accelerant of what we're seeing. So exactly what you're saying is that there's a power in allowing people to not only understand their voice, but their collective power, individually help them, but also shift what it is to be a parent in this country, giving
That's so true. Joe Waters in Capita did a survey of a huge number of families in North Carolina about just their current well-being status. And the shocking finding was that 40% of Gen Z parents are lonely.
Yeah.
And you go, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. You and I know
Yeah. What it does to your health. Yeah.
what it does to your personal health, but what it also does to your relational experience.
Yeah. I
And
know.
hence, again, this kind of work of finding the collective, elevating the vision, creating the framing of the messaging movement, and really starting to imagine a new era for the way our social beliefs and structures is in front of us right now at every level, not least of which is in face of the climate disaster. How do we come arm in arm to build the power of our collective energy and strength to tackle the big issues about human well-being, but also thriving into our future? There's never been more of a greater urgency in the moment. Okay, so we've got just 12 or 13 more minutes, Dana. So, Dr. Suskind, what's your next? What's really? I hear your Atlantic article. I can feel your power, but how do you think about the horizon? 5 years, 10 years. What's on? Where are you headed in your own discovery process, your own imaginings, your own considerations? What's really capturing you? If you could see that for your vision, where are you headed?
Yeah. So are you talking vision of Parent Nation or the overall work of the center?
You.
Me as a human being?
You as a leader, you as a leader, as a visionary,
Oh, I don't
as an
have.
as an influencer, please, how are you thinking about where you with what you've created, what's around you, what you know, where are you headed?
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of life. We're never sure. We can always. I can tell you where my North Star is. I can't tell you where I'm going to go, but my life's work, I think very similar to yours, is dedicated to really doing right by the children of our country and the world and their parents. And at every step of my journey, from the moment I became a doctor to a surgeon to a social scientist to whatever I am now, it's always been dictated by this larger North Star, that, children come into this world, and it is on us to allow them to reach the promise of their promise. I'm very excited about, the work of the center. Obviously, the Parent Nation framework is a larger sort of public will building that I hope continues to, in partnership with, like frameworks that you're pushing forward, helps get our country and our nation focused on what we need to do right by our children. But I'm also excited about the research that we're doing and the teaching and, mentoring the next generation. While I haven't joined the AARP, it's also getting the next generation ready and going. And I'm heartened, right? Look, it's a complicated moment in time. But when I look to those that are coming, after us, I feel hopeful. So I hope that I can be part of their mentorship and keep pushing forward change. How do you like that for the vaguest answer?
Awfully good. Well, I heard in the middle of it, in some of the dialogues and the tables I've been at recently, every once in a while I hear the word of this work and this movement is also trying to recapture the sacred. There's something bigger beyond us that is also, I think, a part of the narrative that's emergent. And I'm hearing it in different places. And so, your sense of the next generation, your sense of hope and possibility, your sense of we're all on the journey and with whatever gifts we've been given to add to the North Star that we all kind of believe in is really, profound and meaningful. And I am deeply thankful for your leadership in this space and your commitment to all of this. And it's humbling to me to watch this and to see it, and exciting at the same time. So, in finishing up, what give me a couple parting thoughts that you would wish the audience to think about today, what they might be able to do or should do from your perspective. What are your thoughts? And then we'll close.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about big, lofty ideas and where we need to go as a nation, but I have a feeling that many of your listeners are also probably parents or caregivers. And so I want to impart a thought that hopefully will decrease some of the stress. That, give yourself grace. The truth is that these last few years haven't been easy. And not only to give yourself grace because you should give yourself grace, but also if you're raising a child, there really is something called good enough parenting. If you anchor on the love of your child, that early relational help, and know that there are some times where you're going to be the best of parents and sometimes where you'll feel like you've fallen flat. It's still okay. And giving yourself grace will give yourself the sort of permission to just be in the moment and be the best self that you can be. That was it. So
Phenomenal, phenomenal. Those moments of meaning, those moments of connection never have to be perfect, but those moments matter.
yeah.
And so you know that, we all know that. And I want every parent to know that it's these moments, and no parent is perfect. And
No.
moments of connection are deeply meaningful, but also powerful.
Yeah.
Dennis Suskind, what a joy to be together. What a joy to have a conversation. As always, I look forward to our continued collaborations and touch points and gatherings. And I wish you luck with the Atlantic Auto when it comes out. Do you know when it's coming?
I'll be sending it over to you. They at the end of this week. So
wow, that's great. Yeah. So to be continued in our conversation and our journey together. But again, thanks for spending time with us. I wish you well.
Thank you so much.
Okay.